Hello, my name is Lisa Fairbrother, and I'm a professor in the Department of English Studies. And today I'd like to give you a very brief introduction to my research field. Okay, so today my talk is entitled Using English in the Real World, and basically it's an introduction to the relationship between sociolinguistics and intercultural interaction. So my research fields basically revolve around sociolinguistics and intercultural interaction. So sociolinguistics examines the many different and often complex relationships between language and society. On the other hand, intercultural interaction looks at how people actually communicate and interact with people from different backgrounds. So apart from courses that I teach in sociolinguistics and intercultural interaction, I also teach first year English skills, and this year I'll be in charge of the C class. So I'd like to start by first asking you a simple question, and that is, why are you studying English? And you know, there are many answers to this, but perhaps some of your answers are, for example, in order to pass English exams, or because you love the challenge of learning the intricacies of English grammar, or to be able to use English with friends or at work sometime in the future. So I expect that most people, when they imagine or when they think about their motivations for learning English, probably they might have a little bit of all of those answers. But if you chose number 3, this means that you're already thinking about using English as a practical communication tool, and in order to use English in the world outside the classroom. However, when we start about thinking about what it means to use English in the real world, this is where things start to get a little bit tricky. And that's because people from different backgrounds often interact in English in very different ways, which can sometimes lead to misunderstandings and other kinds of difficulties. So I'd first like to think a little bit about who actually speaks English in the world today. So according to Jennifer Jenkins, English is spoken in approximately 75 territories, either as a first or an official second language. And of those territories, there are 329 million people who speak English as their first language. Other words used to describe this are native language or mother tongue, for example. And those include countries such as the United States of America, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, for example. On the other hand, there are also 430 million people in the world who speak English as a second or an official language. So these are places where people might speak their first language at home, but when they go to the workplace or when they go to school, everything is conducted through the medium of English. So some countries that fit this kind of category are, for example, Singapore, the Philippines, Nigeria, and India. And then we get to the third group of people that speak English. And according to estimates, there are over 1 billion people who speak English as a foreign language. So in other words, they're not speaking English as their first language, they're not speaking English as an official language, but they've learned English either at school or on the internet or in other ways. For example, there are many foreign language speakers of English in Japan, in France, in Russia, Thailand, and Mexico, to name just a few. So next I want to kind of think a little bit more about this, because if there are so many people around the world speaking English, this can sometimes lead to misunderstandings because people are using English in different ways. And here I have an example that I've taken from Scollin and Jones's research, which is about or it kind of deals with a Chinese businessman and an American businessman who've been chatting at a conference. And the Chinese businessman is called Mr. Wong, the American businessman is called Mr. Smith. So Mr. Wong says, "Well, I must be going now, but I really enjoyed our chat." And Mr. Smith says, "Yes, me too. We should get together to have lunch sometime." And Mr. Wong replies, "That's a good idea." Okay, so I think this conversation is quite nice. The English is great. The English is fluent. We can see no grammatical errors, perhaps no problems with vocabulary. It seems as if the two men had a very pleasant conversation. However, 3 weeks later, Mr. Wong is annoyed because Mr. Smith still hasn't called him to arrange to have lunch. So this is, we can see this as perhaps one good example of a misunderstanding. So now we have to think about, well, why is there a misunderstanding? Why did Mr. Wong interpret that conversation differently from Mr. Smith? And I think one way that sociolinguists will look at this is from the perspective of what we call the ethnography of communication, which basically means that the different people from different backgrounds have different rules that they follow when they communicate. And by this I don't mean grammatical rules or rules about the use of vocabulary, but I mean like the different way that they organize language when they communicate with one another. So first off, one of the issues that I think we can see in this dialogue has to do with content. In other words, the words that people use and the meaning they want to convey are sometimes different. So in the dialogue, when Mr. Smith said, "Let's have lunch," he was probably intending this as a type of greeting. So in other words, "I like you, I enjoyed talking to you, so let's be friends and maybe we could have lunch someday." On the other hand, as we can see that Mr. Wong became annoyed, we can assume that Mr. Wong heard a genuine invitation. So to him, those words, "let's have lunch," implied that Mr. Smith would call him again and try to arrange a lunch meeting sometime. Now, if we look at this dialogue a little bit further, we could also perhaps draw the conclusion that also one of the problems here has to do with sequencing, or in other words, the order in which you say something may be important. So it's not the words themselves, but rather what comes first and what comes last. So perhaps you're aware of this, but in English, for example, it's very common for the most important point to be mentioned at the very beginning of a conversation. In contrast, in Chinese, Persian, and Japanese, in many times, the most important thing that someone wants to say is likely to come towards the end of that conversation. So because Mr. Wong heard, "let's have lunch," he heard that at the end of the conversation. There's a possibility that Mr. Wong thought that that must be important and therefore a genuine invitation. But this conversation, we can even go one step deeper and go to a deeper level. And, you know, there's also the possibility here that attitudes may also have played a part in Mr. Wong becoming annoyed. So, for example, sometimes simple misunderstandings can lead to the development of negative feelings towards others or reinforce the negative stereotypes we already hold. So often if we have a feeling or a negative feeling about something, every new negative experience kind of can sometimes build on those past negative experiences that we've had. So we can imagine, perhaps, that Mr. Wong may not just be annoyed by Mr. Smith, but this incident might reinforce his stereotype that Americans are insincere and unreliable. And based on his past experiences, Mr. Wong might even think that Mr. Smith was looking down on him and is possibly racist towards Chinese people. So we can see here that just a very simple misunderstanding around the term "let's have lunch" could be exaggerated and blown up into something bigger based on the past experiences of the participants. So this was just one simple example showing people from different language backgrounds, but there are many other things that can affect our use of language and our understanding of others. And these include things like our gender, our social class, our age, our profession, the geographical region we come from, the social or ethnic groups we belong to, our different worldviews, our different attitudes, and sometimes even politics and economic forces can affect the way that we understand each other. So, to conclude, in order to use English effectively in the real world, we don't only need to know about the language, so, the technical aspects of language, vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, for example, but we need to understand how people from different backgrounds use English differently and how they might view the world in a different way from us. So I hope that you will start to think more about how language is used around you, and that you will learn to enjoy the intercultural communication roller coaster as much as I do. Okay, and finally, here are some of the references that I referred to in my talk. I hope that I'll be able to meet some of you very soon in the actual classroom. Until then, bye-bye.